I wasn't supposed to be seen. That was the unspoken agreement, whispered in glances and signed in sighs. At my sister Lily's vineyard wedding, I was technically a guest. My name printed wrong on a place card, my seat tucked so far from the head table it felt like a punishment. A family wedding, they called it, but only certain family counted. I guess I should have been grateful they remembered to include me at all. Except when I arrived, I realized something deeper. They didn't forget me. They'd erased me on purpose. The vineyard sparkled. That much I'll admit. White roses cascaded down stone archways, fairy lights twisted through olive trees, and a string quartet played Vivaldi like we were starring in a wedding magazine spread. But even under that curated glow, the seating chart told the truth. My table wasn't by the fountain or near the view. It was beside the staff tent, next to the speakers, where the music shook your teeth and drowned out conversation. I spent most of the evening nodding at jokes I couldn't hear and pretending not to notice when people passed me without even a glance. I arrived early, like I always do. Habit, efficiency, a side effect of working in consulting, where timing was currency and invisibility, a skill I'd honed to perfection. I wore the dress Lily asked me to. Blush-toned, floor-length, modest neckline. She'd sent a Pinterest board in the group chat with the note, "Let's all keep it soft and simple, okay?" Translation, don't wear anything that makes you stand out. Especially you, Vivian. My name is Vivian Hart, 33, and I used to think invisibility was an advantage. I made a living analyzing risk and bias in artificial intelligence systems, predictive behaviors, decision trees, coded exclusion. I could dissect a hiring algorithm with surgical precision, show a boardroom how their software quietly filtered out entire populations based on a single line of flawed logic. I just never thought I'd be living inside one. Until the wedding, where my own family's algorithm had quietly coded me out. My father gave me a quick, distracted hug when I arrived. My mother air-kissed the space beside my cheek. "You're here already?" she asked, more surprised than pleased. Then she turned to adjust my younger sister's veil, brushing a bit of non-existent lint from Lily's shoulder with the tender affection I hadn't seen directed at me in over a decade. I smiled and stepped back into the role they'd cast me in. Quiet, supportive sister, no lines, no spotlight. Lily looked radiant, of course. That's not bitterness, just fact. She always had that kind of glow, the kind that makes strangers want to hand her champagne or offer her the mic. I used to think it was luck. Later, I realized it was choreography. My sister curated her life with hashtags and color palettes. She didn't just post, she branded. Lily was the type to send handwritten thank you cards with coordinated stamps. She never picked a restaurant that didn't photograph well. And still, I came. RSVP'd, yes, booked my own travel, paid for my own accommodations, even after she told me the wedding party room block was full. I showed up in the correct dress. I smiled when I found Vivienne scribbled on a folded name card at table 17, and I bit my tongue when I realized I was seated next to my aunt's second husband's podiatrist, a man who referred to Lily's wedding as quite the Instagrammable affair. It wasn't until I saw the family photo list, taped behind the floral arch beside the photographer's station, that it hit me in full. My name wasn't on it. Every combination was accounted for. Lily and Mom, Lily and Dad, Lily and Uncle Greg, Lily and the bridesmaids, Lily and the flower girl, no Lily and Vivian, not even sisters. I stood in front of the list for a solid minute, waiting to find myself like I was playing a game of Where's Waldo with my own name. And when it wasn't there, I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I just folded the list in half and handed it to the coordinator like I was helping organize it. Because that's what I did. I helped. I made things easier. I shrunk myself when the room needed space. And for most of my life, I mistook that shrinking for grace. I think the final crack came during the toast rehearsal, not the real one, the casual one the night before, where everyone swapped stories over pizza and wine in the tasting room. I offered to say a few words, just a small toast, maybe something about growing up together, about Lily's laugh and the time she rescued a duckling from a storm drain. But my mother had smiled gently and said, "Why don't you just relax and enjoy the night?" Then Lily added, "Yeah, we all agreed less is more." That was the phrase. We all agreed. I nodded. Of course we did. Except I didn't. I wasn't even asked. But my silence had always been interpreted as agreement, a blank slate they could scribble their preferences onto. I never protested, never contradicted, even when my resume was longer than Lily's entire marketing team combined. Even when the panel she once bragged about being shortlisted for was one I'd helped organize behind the scenes. Even when the startup her fiancé worked for had once tried to poach me, they didn't know that. Why would they? I never told them, because somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting them to care. But something shifted that night. Not rage, not even pain, just clarity. Like watching a room you've stood in your whole life slowly rotate, showing you the parts you'd trained yourself not to look at. I wasn't there for recognition anymore. I was there to remind them, quietly, calmly, that being invisible didn't mean I wasn't paying attention. And that reminder would come in the form of one sentence, one perfectly timed observation, one scalpel of truth that would cut through the noise, the lights, the curated joy. The rest of the wedding could sparkle, the wine could flow, the cameras could click, but eventually someone would say the wrong thing to the wrong nobody, and that nobody would speak. And when she did, the wedding would shift. I didn't touch the water glass in front of me. It was fogged from condensation, slightly chipped on the rim, like someone had used it before and wiped it clean in a rush. The linen napkin was wrinkled. My name card, misspelled as Sabrina, had been folded in the wrong direction, so the tinted card wouldn't stand. It flopped onto the plate, blank side up. I straightened it anyway. Not because I needed them to know who I was, but because I did. My sister's voice echoed in the distance, laughter trailing her like perfume. She floated from guest to guest, glowing, exactly how everyone expected her to be. No one noticed me adjusting a place card that should have been right from the start. Aunt Carol leaned across the table, blocking my view. "Did you hear Aubrey's boss is here? Kale something? Oh, he's just so dashing and important." Her whisper turned giddy. "I heard he knows Oprah." I nodded like I cared, lips curling at the corners. Carol had never once asked what I did for work. I could have said I was on a spaceship to Mars, and she would have gone back to commenting on Aubrey's hair extensions. It wasn't personal, it was systemic. This entire family was built on a hierarchy of visibility, and I had long been classified as low priority. I watched the photographers swirl around Aubrey and her bridal circle like bees around a queen. Cameramen angled lenses to make her husband look taller, her friends more elegant, her life more curated. I imagined what that same camera would do if it pointed at me, pause, adjust the focus, maybe click once before swinging away like I was a lighting stand that accidentally wandered into frame. A stage extra. That's how it always felt. From my peripheral, I saw my cousin Brielle give me a look. Not unkind, just vague, like she recognized my face but couldn't place the context. Then she leaned in to whisper to her fiancé. I caught the words, "Sabrina?" and "tech" or something. He shrugged. That shrug stung more than it should have. I had reviewed funding contracts worth more than his annual salary, but I wasn't the one with a tailored name tag and matching couple attire. My phone buzzed silently in my lap, an automated alert from one of the startups I still advise remotely. A notification that their CTO had just resigned. I tapped into the analytics instinctively, hiding the screen beneath the tablecloth, running a quick risk forecast in my mind. I could have sent one text to steer the founder's next hire, and he would have implemented it without question. But here, at this wedding, I was just Sabrina, with a backward name card and a pre-filled salad no one asked if I was allergic to. I excused myself from the table, not dramatically, just politely. As I passed the bar, the bartender looked up like I might be placing an order. I smiled but didn't stop. Even he wasn't sure if I was a guest or staff. Maybe both. It had always been like that at family events. I was the girl who refilled the ice bucket because no one else noticed it was empty. The one who took photos of people, never the one anyone photographed with. Near the reception stage, Cale Donnelly had begun talking to my father. I recognized his profile immediately, smooth, charismatic, confident. He radiated curated success. I paused behind a pillar, watching him gesture with a glass of champagne like he owned the patent on sparkling wit. My mother had joined by now, leaning in like she'd rehearsed the moment. I couldn't hear what she said, but I knew the tone. It was the same one she used when bragging about Aubrey's summer internship at a PR agency 10 years ago, as if it were the launch of NASA's Mars rover. They'd mentioned me once, I was sure of it, in passing, probably not by name, probably as Aubrey's sister. And I knew, without needing confirmation, that Cale hadn't asked any follow-up questions. And maybe that was the part that burned. I didn't want his attention, not in the way my mother seemed to crave it. I didn't need applause or recognition. I wanted awareness, just an ounce of it, just enough to remind the people who raised me that I wasn't a decorative part of the guest list, that I had earned the right to be known. Instead, I returned to my table. The linen napkin was gone. Someone had taken it, or maybe it fell. I picked up the useless name card and slipped it into my purse, a reminder not of being overlooked, but of what I was building. Quietly, on my own terms. And when the first notes of a jazz standard rolled through the reception speakers, I didn't rise to dance. I watched, listened, calculated. Because what they didn't know, and wouldn't ask, was that my time was coming, and it would only take one sentence to change the trajectory of this entire room. I wasn't expecting a second spotlight. One toast was enough. But when the applause died down and the room tried to reset, it couldn't. The air had shifted, and not even the clinking of glasses or the DJ's upbeat track could smooth it over. People were whispering again, but this time they weren't laughing. They were wondering, watching. I sat back at my table, my hands steady but my mind racing. I didn't gloat, but I allowed myself a small breath of recognition. Not victory, just clarity. I had tilted the balance. A few minutes later, while everyone was still grazing the dessert table or lining up for photo ops, a man approached my table. He didn't belong to my branch of the family, nor did he carry the faux polish of a wedding crasher. No, this man moved like someone who was used to rooms parting for him, graceful, intentional, certain. "Excuse me," he said, offering his hand with a nod. "You're Sabrina Hollis, correct?" I looked up slowly. "Yes." "Evan Morgan," he said, Cale's mentor and one of Carradine's earlier investors. The name didn't just land, it rang. Evan Morgan wasn't just anyone in tech finance, he was a quiet legend, a former board member at 2 unicorns, a man whose LinkedIn messages were worth more than most startups' entire rounds, and now he was here, shaking my hand. "I recognized your name when you spoke," he continued. "Didn't realize I'd meet the woman behind that Series B memo in person." For the first time in a long while, I didn't have to shrink my identity to fit someone else's understanding. I didn't have to explain. I just nodded. "I appreciate your precision," he said. "Rare quality." "Thank you," I replied, my voice calm, even. "Would love to talk further. After the wedding, of course," he added, handing me a card. This time the gesture wasn't performative. It was deliberate, private. A signal between equals, not a favor from the powerful. From across the room, I saw Cale watching, and beside him, Aubrey looked like she'd bitten her cheek too hard. But it wasn't their eyes I felt next. It was Gloria's. My soon-to-be mother-in-law stood not far off, her arms folded, and her mouth tight in that way women hold tension when they think no one's watching. She started toward me like a wind gust caught in a silk scarf, forced elegance, masked urgency. "We need to talk," she said without greeting. "Outside." I followed her onto the small balcony, the string lights glowing behind us. "You know," she started, "this is supposed to be about family, togetherness, support. Is that what this is?" I asked quietly. She didn't like the tone. "You've embarrassed everyone tonight." "No," I said. "I just said something true. To someone who needed to hear it." Gloria sighed through her nose. "We all agreed you'd keep a low profile. No surprises. That was the understanding." "We all agreed." That phrase again. The same one she'd used 2 months ago at the rehearsal dinner planning when she assigned me to manage coat check instead of giving a toast like Aubrey. The same one she'd said when I asked if I could wear something colorful, and she responded, We all agreed muted tones would be best. You mean you agreed? I replied, and no one else wanted to argue. You're twisting things, she snapped. No, Gloria, I'm correcting them. She looked me over, and for the first time, I saw it. The calculation, the shift, the realization that maybe I wasn't who she thought she'd quietly marry into the family. You've made yourself very visible tonight, she said. Let's hope that's a good thing. It already is, I answered. For me, at least. She paused. Not because she agreed, but because she knew resistance would cost more than silence. Inside, the music changed to something faster. The lights pulsed a little brighter. Gloria turned and left me on the balcony. She didn't say goodbye. I stayed out a few minutes longer, letting the air hit my skin, cooling the adrenaline beneath my calm. That's when I realized I wasn't just visible now, I was known. Not because I fought for attention, but because I waited for the moment when truth didn't need volume, just timing. The rest of the evening flowed like a symphony I no longer needed to conduct. The spotlight had already shifted, away from the floral centerpieces, away from Aubrey's rehearsed charm, and especially away from Gloria's subtle control. I had said what I needed to say, without raising my voice, without even moving from my seat. But the ripples continued long after. Inside, I saw it happen. Conversations paused as Evan Morgan re-entered the ballroom and was greeted with open arms by the groom. Cale looked visibly flustered. He was smiling too much, blinking too fast. A man not used to being out of control trying to manage optics. Evan leaned in, whispered something, and Cale nodded stiffly, his smile dimming. I didn't need to hear what was said. I knew. Evan had asked for my contact, and Cale had just realized this wedding was no longer the axis around which everyone revolved. Meanwhile, the other guests were beginning to whisper, little things like, "Wait, she's the one who... Isn't that the girl who..." I thought she was just a family friend. They no longer knew how to categorize me, and I wasn't going to help them. Aubrey tried to recover the vibe. She jumped into full hostess mode, calling for champagne towers and pulling guests into photo booths. But the photos lacked energy now, and people's eyes kept drifting toward me. I wasn't posing, I wasn't even smiling. I was simply present. That was enough. Later, when dessert was being served, I found myself back at the table with a plate of untouched lemon tort. I hadn't taken a bite. Across from me sat Gloria, stiff in her chair, lips pursed like the flavor of the evening had gone sour. "You've made your point," she finally muttered. I raised an eyebrow. I wasn't making one. "You do realize this is Cale's night," she continued. "Not yours." I leaned forward slightly. "Then maybe next time don't stage a wedding where visibility is currency and assume I'd be fine staying poor." Gloria's nostrils flared, but she said nothing. Instead, she stood up and left the table, retreating, not regrouping. Her armor had cracked. Aunt Laurel, Gloria's older sister, glided into her seat just seconds later. She didn't say a word at first, just stared at me for a long moment before asking, "Do you know what you did tonight?" "Showed up." She shook her head. "You showed them something they weren't ready to see." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The affirmation felt earned, not gifted. Then she added, "It's funny, we all agreed you'd fade into the backdrop, but some people aren't made for the background." There it was again. We all agreed. But this time, the phrase didn't sting. It sounded like a confession, and maybe even admiration. By the time the father-daughter dance began, I had stepped outside again. I wasn't trying to make a scene, just needed a moment alone. But I wasn't alone for long. Cale came out, hands in his pockets, tie loosened, pretending to be casual. "You okay?" he asked, avoiding eye contact. "I'm great," I said. "You?" He didn't answer immediately. "Evan said you're working with Merit Tech now. You didn't mention that." I wasn't aware I needed to submit a resume to be allowed a piece of cake. He chuckled awkwardly. "It's just surprising. I didn't know you were in that world." "You didn't ask." There was a beat of silence. Then he sighed. "Aubrey said you might try something, make the night about you." I looked at him directly now. "Aubrey says a lot of things. What do you believe?" He didn't answer. Not really. Instead, he said, "You still have the card Evan gave you?" I pulled it out from my clutch, held it in my hand. "Why?" "Just curious." "You worried I might use it?" He didn't smile, didn't deny it either. That's when I knew. This wasn't just about a wedding anymore. This was about value, perception, and power. I tucked the card away again. "Don't worry," I said, turning to leave. "I already did." I wasn't supposed to hear her, but the banquet hall's acoustics had a way of carrying whispers like thunder, especially when you're seated near the wall sconces, alone with your untouched cake. My mother-in-law, well, soon-to-be ex-Mill, if she had anything to do with it, was talking to her sister, that same tight-lipped aunt who'd once asked if I had any hobbies outside of being dull. They were 2 flutes in, clinking glasses like the celebration was theirs alone. "She's not even memorable," my MIL said. "No presence, no flair. You know what she is? Background. Filler. Aubrey's sister just takes up space." And they laughed. Not a burst. A small, controlled, expensive kind of laugh. The kind that doesn't disturb mascara. The kind that cuts deep because it was never meant to be hidden. I didn't move. Didn't react. If the wedding had taught me anything, it was how to blend into linen and florals. But my fingers clenched around the silver cake fork hard enough that I left indentations. Not out of rage, but purpose. Because when someone labels you background, the most satisfying thing you can do is become the plot twist, quietly, deliberately, without needing a spotlight to prove the shift. The insult didn't surprise me. My mother-in-law had always preferred women who sparkled on cue, women who said, "Yes, ma'am," and knew the difference between Italian leather and patent knockoffs. I was none of those things. I wore comfort. I spoke plainly. I didn't play piano or pour wine at the correct angle, but what I had was strategy. And at that moment, I saw every move unfold like a chessboard. I didn't need to yell. I just needed to act. When I stood up, no one looked. That's the thing about being dismissed. You gain invisibility, and with invisibility comes freedom. I walked out through the side corridor, heels clicking against the marble with a rhythm I hadn't realized I'd memorized from startup pitch meetings and client acquisition dinners. Moments they never saw because they weren't on Instagram, because they didn't glitter, because they weren't made to be clapped for. What they didn't know, earlier that week I'd signed a non-public agreement with Kale's board. I was stepping in as a strategy consultant, not just for retention recovery, but for future rounds. Kale hadn't made it official at the wedding out of decorum, but the numbers were in my inbox. My insight would steer millions. And the moment I signed that document, I knew something they didn't. I wasn't background. I was back-end. I was the source code, and they'd just been using the app. Back inside the ballroom, things hadn't changed. Music played, lights dimmed. Aubrey floated across the floor like an editorial spread. And I returned to my seat, face calm, plate still untouched. But my energy had shifted. I didn't need Kale to validate it. I didn't need my mother to announce it. It lived in me now. Quiet power, building. When Kale approached the table again, this time without fanfare, my MIL noticed. Her posture stiffened, her eyes flicked from his tailored cufflinks to my face. "Excuse me," he said, addressing her. "Would you mind if I borrow Sabrina for a moment?" Her mouth parted slightly, confusion shading her features like a badly lit portrait. "Of course," she murmured, stepping aside. As we walked away, I didn't look back. Kale didn't speak until we reached the side exit near the dessert table. "You've been quiet since earlier," he said. I nodded. "Listening," I replied. "Absorbing." He exhaled, then smiled. "That sentence you said earlier? It's been echoing." I tilted my head. "The one about retention or the one about visibility?" He laughed, the sound rich but edged. "Both." Then he handed me a folded slip of paper. It wasn't a card. It was a shareholder schedule, not public, not even digitized. "We want your voice on the board," he said, officially. I didn't open it right away. I just slid it into my clutch and said, "Let's see how loud I can get without raising my voice." We returned before the toast. My mother-in-law blinked as I took my seat again, but this time her smirk didn't rise. She sensed something. She couldn't name it, but she felt the shift. The background had moved. They'd planned every angle, every floral arch, champagne tower, and place setting with a precision that bordered on obsession. Aubrey's wedding was always meant to be a curated dream, filtered in soft pastels and shared through a perfectly timed carousel of Instagram stories. And just like in every storybook they modeled it after, there was no room for disruption, especially not from me. In their eyes, I was still the supportive sister-in-law, the background blur, the silent plus one, the woman whose dress should complement but never compete. So when the photographer called my name, not once but twice, and then gestured for me to step into the center of the shot, everything froze. Literally. Aubrey's lips parted around a word that didn't make it out. My mother-in-law looked like she'd just swallowed a lemon whole. Even Cale's jaw tensed as he glanced at the gathering guests, unsure of how to frame what was unfolding. I, on the other hand, didn't move, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. What happens when someone the family agreed to keep in the shadows gets summoned into the light? What do they do when the narrative rearranges itself without their approval? The photographer, a young woman named Isla, smiled and waved again. "Miss Hollis, could you move a little closer to the center? We want one with all the key family members." Key family members, not extended, not extras. Her words sliced the air like a perfectly aimed scalpel. I stepped forward. The silence wasn't empty. It was dense, brittle. My heels clicked once, twice, 3 times against the patio stone until I stood between Cale and his aunt, just a breath away from Aubrey's shoulder. Her smile was rigid, eyes laser-focused on Isla. "Maybe there's been a mistake," she offered sweetly. "Sabrina isn't technically—" Isla cut her off gently. "Actually, I spoke to the groom. He said she's essential." Essential. That word did more damage than a dozen insults ever could. It didn't scream. It didn't point fingers. It simply rewrote placement, importance, presence. Suddenly, the girl they agreed would fade into neutral, had her own spotlight, and it wasn't accidental. Cale, to his credit, didn't flinch. He simply placed one hand lightly on my shoulder. A signal, not for possession, but solidarity. And for the camera's sake, I smiled. A quiet, knowing smile. The kind that doesn't need captions or hashtags. The kind that tells a longer story without revealing a single spoiler. We took 3 shots. The third one had Isla saying, "Let's make this the one everyone remembers." And though no one said it out loud, we all knew. This was the photo that would circulate. This was the one that would live in frames and wedding albums, no matter how desperately some people might crop it later. After the photos, the air was different. Conversations dipped when I walked by. Champagne glasses didn't clink as enthusiastically. My name, once barely whispered, became a subject of speculation. Was she really asked to be in the center? Did Cale approve that? Why her? It was strange, in a way, how much power was held in the perception of placement. I hadn't made a speech. I hadn't stormed out or delivered ultimatums. All I'd done was stand where I was asked to stand, and that alone broke their choreography. Aubrey approached me near the garden wall, her bouquet clutched tighter than necessary. "You've made your point," she said, voice low and tight. "But this isn't about you." I tilted my head, calm as ever. I didn't say it was. The photographer asked for a family photo. I showed up. She laughed bitterly. "You always show up, like Ivy, quiet, climbing." I considered that. I'll take that as a compliment. Ivy holds things together. She turned and walked off, heels digging into the grass like she could punish the earth for allowing me to breathe the same air. Later, when speeches started, Cale's toast carried the usual script: love, gratitude, a few polite jokes. But then, toward the end, he glanced toward me again. "And to those who've supported quietly," he said, glass raised, "who weren't always seen, but always showed up. I see you now. We all do." There was a shift, subtle but irreversible. My mother-in-law clapped lightly. Her sister didn't. Aubrey's expression didn't change, but her knuckles whitened around the stem of her flute. But me? I sat taller. Because sometimes the sentence that rewrites a legacy isn't loud. It doesn't slam doors or overturn tables. It just gets said into a microphone at the exact moment everyone expects you to stay silent. It wasn't just the photos or the speeches. It was the aftermath, the subtle shift in gravity, that changed everything. For the first time since I arrived, people began approaching me not with forced smiles or duty-bound nods, but with something new in their expressions. Recognition, respect, curiosity. I saw it in the way shoulders turned slightly when I passed, in how strangers leaned in, eager to introduce themselves like I was no longer just a placeholder in someone else's narrative. That's when my mother-in-law made her move. She approached with the kind of stride that had probably once commanded rooms. Her heels tapped sharply on the slate tiles, her lips pressed into that permanent line of polite disapproval she'd mastered over decades of family events and social dinners. She held a coupe of champagne in one hand like a weapon, and I could already feel the tension around us rise as if the crowd anticipated something. "I suppose," she began, "you're enjoying yourself a bit too much, Sabrina." I didn't flinch. "Is there a limit on that?" Her eyes flicked to a passing server, then back to me. "You've always had this ability to insert yourself." I smiled calmly. I was invited. She gave a thin laugh, brittle as glass. "You weren't meant to be the center of attention." "Neither was I trying to be. Weddings," she said, voice dropping an octave, "are meant to celebrate the right kind of people. Brides, grooms, family names with legacy, women with a certain refinement. And I don't qualify?" Her eyes narrowed. "You've always been clever, Sabrina, but clever doesn't make you wedding material." Ah, there it was. The word again. That phrase, wedding material. They'd all used it behind closed doors. I was certain. To them, I was too much of everything that couldn't be softened. Too direct, too independent, too polished in ways they didn't respect. I didn't fit into the curated palette of demure florals and submissive smiles. What she didn't know was, I never wanted to fit in. "I didn't come here to be wedding material," I said. "I came to be myself. And if that draws attention, maybe you should question the template, not the outlier." Before she could respond, a tall man in a pale blue linen blazer stepped beside us. "Excuse me," he said politely to my MIL, "but I believe you're Sabrina Hollis?" I nodded, extending a hand. "I'm Peter, the groom's uncle. I was hoping we could talk. Your name came up earlier, in a very good way." My mother-in-law blinked, twice. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She stepped back as Peter guided me away toward a smaller circle of guests who were waiting with interest. One by one, people greeted me, not because I was someone's guest, but because of who I was. A tech strategist, a speaker, a woman who'd funded startups and mentored leaders. They weren't here to flatter. They were here because the story around me had shifted. And in that moment, I saw it clearly. I wasn't the disruption. I was the reveal. These guests weren't ignoring the bride. They were reacting to something that felt real. In a space saturated with facades, filtered perfection, and plastic praise, I had shown up grounded, and some people noticed. I lost count of how many hands I shook that evening, of how many kind, curious faces asked thoughtful questions, or referenced a talk I'd given years ago, or admitted they'd heard of a deal I'd closed. My past wasn't a secret here. It was a foundation, and it was solid. From across the lawn, I could see my MIL again, standing near the dessert table, posture too upright, watching me. Her expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened into something even colder than before. Because she knew. Without raising my voice, without interrupting a single toast or pulling focus intentionally, I had become part of the story, permanently. And there was no way to erase me now. By the time the first dance began, I had returned to my seat, not center stage, not spotlighted, just present, entirely myself. Guests continued to wander over in small waves between songs. some with questions, others with stories, some just to say it was refreshing to meet someone who didn't need to perform. And that's when Cale sat beside me. He looked at me like he had something to say, something important. But instead he leaned close and whispered, "They're talking about you." I raised an eyebrow. "In a good way?" He gave a slight smile. "In a real way, which is better." And then he added something I'll never forget. "You've always been wedding material. They just built the wrong kind of weddings." There was something about dancing at a wedding when you knew your presence unsettled more people than it comforted. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, a soft jazz tune winding through the floral-scented air. Couples spun gently beneath the string lights. But I wasn't dancing, not because no one asked, but because the silence I carried had become its own language. And tonight, silence spoke volumes. Earlier that week, my sister's fiancé had sent a group email to clarify logistics. It included a gentle but unmistakable sentence buried between travel reminders and seating assignments. "Let's all agree this wedding isn't about drama. Everyone should aim to keep things light and peaceful." I knew what that meant. I was the drama. The unspoken clause, "We all agreed Sabrina would behave." But no one had asked what I agreed to. I didn't argue. I didn't reply to the email. And now, as champagne flutes clinked and carefully rehearsed laughter filled the air, my silence rang louder than any toast. I hadn't spoken to the bride since the ceremony, not because I held a grudge, but because she didn't make time. I'd smiled, applauded, even stepped aside so the photographers could capture the angles she wanted. I watched her beam at the camera, at her new in-laws, at the curated friends in matching gowns who toasted her future. And I realized something she hadn't. She wasn't avoiding me. She was pretending I never existed. And so I vanished. Not literally, of course. I stayed exactly where I had been assigned, table 14, far enough from the sweetheart table to feel like a diplomatic afterthought. I held polite conversations with a charming elderly couple who assumed I was with the catering team, then laughed kindly when I told them I was actually the bride's older sister. Their expressions froze for a beat too long. "Oh," the woman said. "I thought the sister was giving a speech tonight." "No," I smiled. We all agreed it was better I didn't. Later, I slipped away from the dance floor and wandered the garden path behind the reception tent. Twinkling lights lined the hedges. In the distance, I could hear the DJ announcing the cake cutting. I didn't rush back. I wasn't needed there. In fact, I had been deliberately excluded from the cake table, a fact I overheard when a tipsy cousin mentioned keeping the vibe uncluttered. And it hit me, not with sadness, but clarity. They wanted me to show up, to be present enough for appearances, but not so present that I reminded them of what they'd pushed away. They wanted a silent sister, a polite woman, a placeholder, not a person. So I gave them exactly what they asked for. I stayed quiet, and that silence, it began to shape the night. It started with glances, then whispered questions, then sideways looks toward my empty seat. Guests noticed when I didn't reappear for the bouquet toss. They noticed when I missed the midnight toast. They noticed when the bride finally asked someone, "Has anyone seen Sabrina?" By the time I returned to the venue, an hour later, after sitting beneath an ancient oak tree behind the garden, I was different. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because I had chosen absence as my reply, and absence, I've learned, leaves room for reflection. As I stepped back inside, my heels soft against the wooden flooring, the music dipped just slightly. I caught the eyes of 3 different guests, people who had ignored me earlier. Now they smiled nervously. One even opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but didn't. My sister saw me too. She froze mid-conversation, her gaze locked on mine. I held it, just long enough to remind her, you don't get to erase people and expect them to smile. Then I turned and walked out again, not in rage, not in bitterness, but in full awareness of the power of restraint, the weight of presence, and the deafening volume of silence when it's wielded on purpose. That night, I didn't speak a single sentence that could be quoted or twisted, but I made sure my absence was unforgettable. The morning after the wedding, the villa felt like a half-deflated balloon. The staff moved quietly between tables, collecting empty flutes and wrinkled napkins like curators clearing a forgotten museum. Somewhere near the pool, the remains of last night's celebration wilted in the tropical sun, and in the center of it all, my MIL, technically my ex-Mill, held court with her espresso like a general counting casualties, but the only casualty she could see was me. "She did all right," I heard her say. "She kept her mouth shut at least. That's a win." She didn't whisper. She never did. Her voice sliced the air like a sugar-coated blade, designed to wound without blood. She was speaking to her sister, another woman in pearls and practiced cruelty, sipping bitterness like it was imported tea. I was standing behind the pergola, waiting for the hotel shuttle, but I wasn't invisible. They knew I was there. That was the point. "She didn't even cry this time," her sister added with a smirk. "Well," Mill replied, setting down her cup, "maybe she finally learned her place." That sentence had once crushed me. Years ago, I might have curled into myself, questioned everything, tried to prove her wrong with effort, kindness, performance. But not today. Not after last night. Because this time I didn't fight her narrative, I let it rot on its own. I stepped forward slowly, heels clicking against the terracotta tiles. Their conversation faltered. I didn't greet them. I didn't offer pleasantries. I walked past their table with the stillness of someone who had nothing left to explain. Mill's smile twitched. "Leaving already?" she asked, voice like lacquer over resentment. "I was never really here," I replied calmly, "just a name on the seating chart." The silence that followed was delicious. I didn't wait for a retort. I let my words linger in the humid air and disappeared down the pathway lined with wilting hydrangeas, feeling their stares cling to the back of my dress. Last night hadn't gone how anyone expected. There was no outburst, no dramatic confrontation, but the shift had been seismic. People felt it. The way conversations grew awkward when I wasn't around to shoulder the emotional labor. The way relatives started asking quiet questions about why I was seated so far away. The way my absence from key wedding moments had created more noise than my presence ever did. It was ironic. Mael had warned everyone for months that I'd be the problem, that I'd ruin the wedding with jealousy, with anger, with my history. She'd prepared the family like I was a storm to board windows against, but the only thing I brought was calm, stillness, decency, and in doing that, I exposed every cruel assumption for what it was. Projection. When the photographer reviewed the footage the night before, she'd found something odd. There were dozens of shots where I was missing, not because I'd hidden, but because I wasn't invited into the frame. She asked the bride if that was intentional. My sister had stammered something vague, and the photographer, unaware of any politics, casually remarked, "Well, that's going to age poorly." That sentence traveled faster than gossip. By breakfast, I could feel it. The shift. People who had dismissed me were now unsure. People who had whispered about me were now whispering about them. MIL noticed it too, hence her performance this morning. It wasn't just about me being silent. It was about me not giving her anything to weaponize. I had stayed elegant, detached, present, but untouchable. And in a family built on petty drama and triangulation, that was the most dangerous thing I could have done. I reached the shuttle stop and set my suitcase down. A younger cousin, one of the few who had approached me with kindness, ran to catch me. "You're leaving already?" she asked. "Early flight," I smiled. She hesitated, then pulled me into a hug. "I just wanted to say, last night, you were the only person who looked like they were telling the truth." I blinked. It felt like everyone else was performing, but you... She paused. "You looked like the only one who didn't need the wedding to prove something." I thanked her, and we stood quietly together until the shuttle arrived. As I boarded, I didn't look back. Not toward the villa, not toward Mill's poisoned patio, not toward the family that had edited me out of their fairy tale to maintain the illusion of harmony, because now the illusion had cracked. And no one could blame me for it. They had spent months warning each other that I would bring drama, that I would cause embarrassment, that I'd make a scene, but all I brought was dignity, And in a world that feeds on outrage, dignity is the most disruptive act of all. Mill had expected me to lash out. Instead, I left quietly. And somehow, that was louder than anything she could have imagined. The morning after the wedding, the villa felt like a half-deflated balloon. The staff moved quietly between tables, collecting empty flutes and wrinkled napkins like curators clearing a forgotten museum. Somewhere near the pool, the remains of last night's celebration wilted in the tropical sun, and in the center of it all, my MIL, technically my ex-Mill, held court with her espresso like a general counting casualties, but the only casualty she could see was me. "She did all right," I heard her say. "She kept her mouth shut at least. That's a win." She didn't whisper. She never did. Her voice sliced the air like a sugar-coated blade designed to wound without blood. She was speaking to her sister, another woman in pearls and practiced cruelty, sipping bitterness like it was imported tea. I was standing behind the pergola, waiting for the hotel shuttle, but I wasn't invisible. They knew I was there. That was the point. "She didn't even cry this time," her sister added with a smirk. "Well," Mill replied, setting down her cup, "maybe she finally learned her place." That sentence had once crushed me. Years ago, I might have curled into myself, questioned everything, tried to prove her wrong with effort, kindness, performance. But not today. Not after last night. Because this time, I didn't fight her narrative. I let it rot on its own. I stepped forward slowly, heels clicking against the terracotta tiles. Their conversation faltered. I didn't greet them. I didn't offer pleasantries. I walked past their table with the stillness of someone who had nothing left to explain. Mill's smile twitched. "Leaving already?" she asked, voice like lacquer over resentment. "I was never really here," I replied calmly. "Just a name on the seating chart." The silence that followed was delicious. I didn't wait for a retort. I let my words linger in the humid air and disappeared down the pathway lined with wilting hydrangeas, feeling their stares cling to the back of my dress. Last night hadn't gone how anyone expected. There was no outburst, no dramatic confrontation, but the shift had been seismic. People felt it, the way conversations grew awkward when I wasn't around to shoulder the emotional labor, the way relatives started asking quiet questions about why I was seated so far away, the way my absence from key wedding moments had created more noise than my presence ever did. It was ironic. Mill had warned everyone for months that I'd be the problem, that I'd ruin the wedding with jealousy, with anger, with my history. She'd prepared the family like I was a storm to board windows against, but the only thing I brought was calm, stillness, decency. And in doing that, I exposed every cruel assumption for what it was. Projection. When the photographer reviewed the footage the night before, she'd found something odd. There were dozens of shots where I was missing, not because I'd hidden, but because I wasn't invited into the frame. She asked the bride if that was intentional. My sister had stammered something vague, and the photographer, unaware of any politics, casually remarked, "Well, that's going to age poorly."